Wildfires force evacuation of Churchill Falls. Construction worker dies on a work site in downtown Montreal. Cargill wins in case brought against it by UFCW Local 401 over COVID infections. Canada to declare a branch of Iran's military a terrorist entity, and the Houthis sink a second ship in the Red Sea. Good morning. It's Thursday, June 20th. I'm Nora. Here are your headlines. First, we start in Churchill Falls, Labrador, where an evacuation order is in place due to an out-of-control wildfire. CBC's Alex Kennedy and Jenna Head report that people were told to evacuate to Happy Valley Goose Bay last night at 8:15 local time. That is nearly 300 kilometers away. In addition to the smoke from the wildfires, the city is also dealing with the same heat wave as much of Canada. Kennedy and Head posted the humidex rather than the temperature, which was at 37 degrees Celsius yesterday. Newfoundland and Labrador Hydro say that essential workers will have to stay on site, though they will be evacuated when necessary. There are about 750 people still in the community. The closest fire is just 10 kilometers away from the community and is burning at Mount Hyde Lake. Next to Montreal, where a subcontractor working for Magil Construction died at a downtown construction site. The worker was killed by something that fell on him. He was in his mid-20s. Labour Minister Jean Boulet was at a conference on workplace injury prevention at the time of the tragedy, reports the Canadian Press. Magil issued a press release saying that the workplace has been shut down and the CNESST is investigating. More health and safety news, but next related to COVID. The union that represents workers at the Cargill High River plant has lost its claim for damages related to how Cargill managed COVID outbreaks. UFCW Local 401 was seeking about $20 million in damages over how the company handled the first wave of COVID outbreaks. There, it left 2 workers dead and a worker's father dead. It also poisoned almost 1,000 people. Heap Bui, Benito Quesada, and Armando Salegue all died as a result of the outbreak. Arbitrator James Casey was not compelled by the argument that Cargill failed to protect its workers. He thought that the company had, quote, largely met its obligations to ensure the health and safety of its High River employees, unquote, despite the fact that almost 1,000 people did get sick. He noted that things moved super fast, and so what could Cargill reasonably had been expected to do? And because the government, quote-unquote, determined that food processing was considered essential, closing Cargill down wasn't an option, even though reducing production always, of course, was an option. The union noted that by April 6, 2020, 30 UFCW members had already died across North America from COVID. Indeed, the Alberta Local was one of Canada's most active and activist, trying to get employers to take more measures to protect all kinds of frontline workers. They had called for a 2-week closure at Cargill to let the virus calm down. So too did a group of local Filipino residents who had asked High River's mayor to close the factory down as well. The damages that UFCW Local 401 had sought were $10,000 per employee and $100,000 to be paid to the union. Next, the Liberals have decided to designate the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps a terrorist group. The one problem with that, well, the group is a part of Iran's armed forces, and things get weird when states declare other states' armed forces terrorist organizations. That's partly why this has never happened before. But something has flipped in the mind of the Liberals, and they have decided that now is the time to call another country's army terrorism. Luca Caruso Moro at CTV reports that the decision will give the Liberals, quote, all of the tools at its disposal, unquote, to combat the Revolutionary Guard's activity in Canada. Caruso Moro explains what this listing does. Quote, it is a crime to knowingly deal with the assets of a listed terrorist entity under Canada's criminal code. Charitable organizations can lose their status if they maintain their connections to terrorist groups, and people found to be associated with those groups can be denied entry into Canada. It also allows banks to freeze assets, unquote. What is awkward is that Iran has conscription. Anyone who comes from Iran who has served in the armed forces might now be caught up under this terrorist law. This is extremely bad news for Iranian international students and any Iranian in Canada who wants to have family and friends come from Iran to Canada to visit. The crimes of the Revolutionary Guard that are mentioned in this article aren't exactly terrorism either. The article focuses a lot on the Revolutionary Guard Corps downing the Ukrainian International Airlines Flight 752, which, while a terrible tragedy, was not actually an act of terror. Iran admitted that it was actually a mistake. And Canada sanctioned Iran's defense minister after Iran sent missiles, quote unquote, towards Israel in April, which is frankly ridiculous, considering that Iran was retaliating for Israel's bombing Iran's embassy in Syria, which, let me check. Right, also damaged Canada's embassy. Caruso Moro doesn't mention anything about conscription in Iran, international students, any impact whatsoever this might have on Iranians in Canada who aren't family members of the victims of the downed Flight 752, how none of the examples of how the Revolutionary Guard are terrorists that Caruso Moro uses are actually terrorism, or how it isn't a normal thing to designate an official military body as a terror entity, even if your country officially loathes that country. He also doesn't mention the fact that Canada's embassy was damaged in that Israeli airstrike too. But hey, the House of Commons was united in their support to do this, and there's nothing quite like good old-fashioned racism to unite Canadian politicians. And finally, the Houthis are still attacking shipping vessels in the Red Sea, and they have just sunk their second ship. The World Shipping Council, European Community Ship Owners Associations, and Asian Ship Owners Association aren't too happy about the Houthis' tactics. They called on the world to intervene to protect the lives of quote-unquote innocent seafarers. The most recent ship to be targeted was Greek, and the most certainty that there seems to be about whether or not there were casualties comes from the shipping lobby that said that at least one crew member, quote, seems certain to have been killed, unquote. That would bring the death toll of the Houthis' ship campaign up to 4. No word on whether or not the shipping organizations are calling on Israel to stop its genocide in Gaza. And a mention of that, UNRWA estimates that just 65,000 people are left in Rafah. That is down from 1.8 million people who had been there when they were told to flee to Rafah by Israel. Those are your headlines for Thursday, June 20th. You're listening to this podcast at sandyandnora.com, on the Real News Network podcast feed, and anywhere you get your podcasts. I hope you have a wonderful Thursday. I'll talk to you tomorrow.